Trump signed an executive order increasing tariff on Canada from 25% to 35%.
But we have made a few deals today that are excellent deals for the country. You know, we're taking in literally trillions of dollars for the country.
New tariffs this Friday night. The turmoil across Canada, where trade talks stand.
Our Prime Minister has been working very diligently on this particular file.
U.S. President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney have spoken, and we are getting limited information about that call from a readout from the Canadian side.
They don't like it. They like resolution, but they'd also like another. They want the right kind of resolution. They want a deal that makes sense for Canada, that makes sense for a Canadian business.
What if I told you America's biggest threat isn't Russia, isn't China, and isn't some distant power halfway across the world? What if the real danger is sitting quietly across the world's longest undefended border, a country everyone thought was America's loyal friend? For over a century, Canada and the United States built one of the strongest partnerships in modern history. Shared factories, shared power grids, open borders, and trillions in trade. The relationship was so stable that most people barely even thought about it. Canada was the dependable neighbor, peaceful, polite, and predictable. But all of that just shattered. On August 1st, 2025, a single decision in Washington triggered something no one expected. A full-blown economic blackout. Not from Beijing, not from Moscow, but from Ottawa. Canada quietly pulled the trigger on the most devastating counterstrike in modern trade history, without firing a single shot. This wasn't about tanks, missiles, or armies. This was about contracts, resources, and quiet moves that economists are already calling checkmate. And here's the terrifying part. Every American family is already feeling the shock. From the coffee in your cup to the car in your driveway, to the jobs in cities across the country. Everything is changing, fast. The U.S. thought it could bully its smaller neighbor into submission. Instead, Canada flipped the script, and in just days, the closest ally America ever had turned into its biggest liability. And what happens next could reshape not just North America, but the entire global order. It all started with 5 words. 5 words that would ignite the most dangerous rift in modern North American history. Canada is the 51st state. That's what Donald Trump sneered in front of cameras before signing a new executive order. At first, Washington insiders brushed it off as just another headline-grabbing jab. But then, at exactly midnight on August 1st, 2025, Trump made it official. Tariffs on Canadian goods didn't just stay at 25%, they surged to 35%. On paper, it looked like just another flex of American muscle. Washington had done this before, slapping tariffs on neighbors, threatening smaller economies, and expecting them to cave. To Trump's team, this was business as usual. Bully the weaker partner, watch them fold, declare victory. But this time was different, because across the border, Canada wasn't folding. It wasn't even shouting back. There were no angry speeches, no fiery press conferences, no desperate cries for negotiation. Instead, Ottawa went silent. And that silence was more dangerous than any threat. Within 72 hours, Canada answered, not with words, but with a move so calculated that economists later described it as the nuclear option. A quiet, cold strike that shook every corner of the American economy. And here's the chilling part. Americans felt it before they even realized what was happening. That $6.98 hoodie at Walmart? Suddenly, $10.98. Your morning coffee, up by nearly 40%. And those millions of Canadian tourists who flood Florida every winter, pumping billions into local economies? 1/3 of them simply stopped crossing the border overnight. Entire condo towers sat empty, restaurants shuttered, mayors went on television begging Washington to fix it. This wasn't just about tariffs anymore. It was something far bigger. It was economic warfare, and for the first time in modern history, America wasn't winning. But here's the kicker. This was only the beginning. When people think of a blackout, they imagine darkness, power grids going down, cities shutting off, everything grinding to a halt. But the blackout Canada unleashed wasn't about lights going out. It was about lifelines being cut. And the first cuts came where no one expected, in your wallet. It started small. Shoppers noticed it first. That $6.98 Walmart hoodie suddenly cost $10.98. Your morning coffee? Nearly 40% higher overnight. What seemed like pennies at first added up fast. Families across America started feeling it in their daily routines. Groceries, clothes, gas, vacations, all shooting up in price. But the real shockwave hit when Canadians themselves pulled back. 1/3 of them simply stopped crossing the border. To most Americans, that might not sound like a big deal. But tell that to Florida, which depends on 3.4 million Canadian visitors every single year. These weren't just tourists buying postcards and keychains. They were long-term renters, car buyers, golfers, diners, pouring more than $6 billion into local economies during the crucial winter months. And in 2025, they vanished. Entire condo complexes sat empty, snowbird towns turned into ghost towns, and restaurant owners were left staring at rows of unused tables. Local mayors went on television, practically begging Washington to fix what was happening. But in Ottawa? Silence. No threats, no tantrums, no press conferences, just cold, calculated execution. That's when the realization hit. This wasn't about tariffs anymore. This was about something much bigger. Economic warfare waged in the most Canadian way possible, quietly, patiently, and devastatingly effective. America thought it was holding the knife, but Canada had just turned the lifeline of U.S. prosperity into the blade at its throat. And the man orchestrating this blackout? He wasn't a career politician. He was a strategist with years of experience in global finance, someone who had faced down economic crises before and won. His name? Mark Carney. And he was about to prove that in a trade war, brains beat brawn every single time. When most people picture a Canadian leader, they imagine politeness, calm speeches, maybe even a little boring. But Mark Carney is nothing like that. Carney isn't your typical career politician. He's not a small-town mayor turned prime minister, and he's not some fiery populist with a megaphone. He's something far more dangerous, a strategist with a global resume that reads like a blueprint for handling chaos. This is the man who steered Canada through the 2008 financial crisis while other nations crumbled. The man who became governor of the Bank of England and helped steer Britain through the nightmare of Brexit. He's orchestrated currency wars, managed collapsing markets, and stared down economic disasters that would terrify most world leaders. And now, he's the Prime Minister of Canada. Which means when Trump thought he was arm wrestling a small, quiet neighbor, he was actually locking horns with one of the sharpest economic minds alive. While Trump slapped tariffs and bragged about quick wins, Carney wasn't playing the same game. He wasn't even playing the same sport. Trump was playing checkers, fast, loud, and reckless. Carney, he was playing four-dimensional chess, thinking 5 moves ahead. His first move was simple but devastating: diversification at warp speed. For decades, Canada depended heavily on the United States for trade. Nearly 80% of its exports crossed the border. To most economists, breaking that level of dependency would take decades, but Carney made it happen in just 1 year. From May 2024 to May 2025, Canada slashed its export dependence on the U.S. from 78% down to 68%, a 10-point drop in 12 months. Economists said it was impossible until Carney did it. Where did all those goods go? Straight into the hands of new partners. Gold exports to the United Kingdom exploded by 473%. Trade with the European Union surged. Mexico, Japan, Australia, each became major buyers almost overnight. It wasn't just diversification, it was an escape plan. Carney was quietly cutting the rope that tied Canada to America's economy and building new bridges everywhere else. But here's the genius part: that wasn't even his real masterstroke. Because while Trump was still obsessed with tariffs on maple syrup and auto parts, Carney was preparing to unleash Canada's hidden weapon. Not politeness, not trade slogans, but something far more powerful: control over the raw materials that fuel the entire modern world. And when Carney pulled that card, the Pentagon itself started to panic. For decades, Americans laughed off Canada as the land of maple syrup, lumber, and hockey. A friendly neighbor, sure, but not a global heavyweight. Mark Carney knew better. Because beneath Canada's forests and frozen tundra lies something far more valuable than trees or tourist attractions: Canada controls some of the largest untapped reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, uranium, and rare earth elements on the planet. The raw ingredients that power everything from your iPhone to Elon Musk's Teslas, from clean energy turbines to the fighter jets guarding American skies. And here's the twist. These aren't nice-to-have materials. They're essentials. Remove them, and modern life collapses. No phones, no electric cars, no satellites, no advanced weapons, no AI. Without these minerals, the world's most powerful economies grind to a halt. Now, here's where it gets even scarier. China already controls nearly 80% of global rare earth processing. For years, Washington has quietly panicked about this, pouring hundreds of millions into projects to reduce reliance on Beijing. But those projects take years to deliver. And Canada? Canada can deliver tomorrow. Carney saw the weakness in America's position and moved fast. While Trump was slapping tariffs, Canada was quietly fast-tracking mining approvals, opening processing plants, and cutting deals with allies. They weren't just digging rocks out of the ground anymore, they were refining them into ready-to-use materials. And here's the kicker, they were doing it in a way that bypassed China completely. Think about that for a second. The Pentagon has been scrambling for a democratic alternative to China's monopoly, and Canada was holding the answer in its back pocket. But instead of strengthening that alliance, Trump's tariffs shoved Canada away. It's like setting your house on fire while the neighbor holding the fire hose walks away. And the consequences? Brutal. Every piece of modern American power, its military, its technology, its energy future, depends on minerals Canada now controls. The chips inside your laptop, the batteries in your EV, the satellites that guide your GPS, the rare earth magnets inside F-35 fighter jets. Without Canada, America is cornered. Trump thought tariffs would break Canada's back. But Carney flipped the script. Suddenly, the only democratic supplier capable of breaking China's stranglehold was no longer Washington's friend. It was Washington's biggest bargaining chip. And Carney wasn't just playing defense. He was weaponizing Canada's resources, turning them into leverage that could force America to its knees. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Carney didn't stop with raw materials. He knew the real battle wasn't just about economics, it was about psychology. And what he unleashed next would unite Canadians like never before, while quietly tearing America apart from within. When most countries get pushed into a corner, they lash out. Angry speeches, protests in the streets, leaders pounding fists on podiums. That's what Washington expected. That's what Trump was counting on. But Canada didn't play that game. Instead of screaming back at America, Canada turned inward. It wasn't rage that fueled them, it was pride. And Mark Carney knew exactly how to channel it. The movement started in Ontario. Premier Doug Ford launched a campaign that seemed simple on the surface. Every product not made in Canada got labeled, shamed, and exposed. Grocery stores, clothing racks, even car dealerships. Canadian flags became badges of honor. Buy Ontario, buy Canada wasn't just a slogan. Overnight, it became a movement. And here's the genius of it. This wasn't about anger. There were no burning American flags in the streets, no mobs calling for boycotts. Instead, it was quiet, polite psychological warfare. Every dollar Canadians spent at home was a silent weapon against Trump's tariffs, and it worked. Canadians united in a way Washington never saw coming. Instead of begging for U.S. trade, they doubled down on self-reliance. Instead of crumbling under tariffs, they redirected spending inward, strengthening local businesses and industries. Meanwhile, across the border, Americans were starting to feel the sting. Car prices climbed by 4 to 8%. Shoes skyrocketed by 40%. Clothing surged nearly 38%. Even Walmart, the one company famous for unbeatable prices, admitted higher costs were inevitable. Ford Motor Company alone bled over $1 billion in tariff costs within months. Procter & Gamble, after holding out as long as possible, finally raised prices on basic household goods, soap, shampoo, toothpaste. These weren't luxury items. These were daily essentials. In Canada, unity was building. In America, frustration was exploding. And Trump? He thought this was a winning strategy. But every step he took was quietly pushing his own voters into economic pain. The politeness offensive was more than a campaign. It was a weapon wrapped in pride and patience. Canadians didn't need to yell. They just needed to stop buying American. And the damage spoke louder than any protest ever could. But as Canada grew stronger at home, something even more dangerous was unfolding abroad. Because while Trump was shutting the door on his closest ally, he was unknowingly cracking it wide open for America's biggest rival. And that rival wasted no time walking right through. By the end of 2025, ordinary Americans were starting to ask a painful question. Why does everything suddenly cost so much? The truth? Trump's tariffs on Canada weren't just hurting Ottawa. They were hammering Main Street USA. Car prices jumped by 4 to 8%. Shoes were up 40%. Clothing? Nearly 38%. Everyday essentials like soap, shampoo, and toothpaste, products families bought without a second thought, suddenly became luxury items. Even Walmart, the king of cheap goods, had to admit defeat. Higher prices were now inevitable. Corporations that had quietly absorbed costs for months finally broke. Ford Motor Company bled more than $1 billion in tariff penalties. Procter & Gamble, maker of household basics, couldn't hold out any longer. They raised prices across the board. This wasn't Wall Street pain. This was kitchen table pain, and voters were furious. But here's the twist no one expected. While Trump was slamming the door on Canada, he was quietly opening one for Beijing. In a move that stunned Washington insiders, Trump announced a 90-day tariff truce with China. That's right. China, America's biggest strategic rival, suddenly got breathing room. Canada, America's closest ally, got higher tariffs. And Beijing didn't waste a second. In those 90 days, China expanded zero-tariff trade access to dozens of African nations, locking in partnerships that strengthened its grip over global supply chains. While Washington fumbled, Beijing tightened its dominance on rare earth processing, the very lifeblood of modern technology. Phones, laptops, EV batteries, satellites, fighter jets, every single one of them still relied on Chinese processing. And now China wasn't just holding on to power, it was multiplying it. Carney saw the contradiction immediately. Trump was punishing Canada, the only democratic country capable of breaking China's monopoly, while giving Beijing time to regroup. It was the ultimate unforced error, and Carney exploited it brilliantly. Because in global strategy, perception is everything. And what America just signaled to the world was devastating. It treats its allies like enemies, and its enemies like allies. That message didn't just echo in Beijing, it sent shockwaves through every U.S. alliance on Earth. And as Canada tightened its grip on critical minerals, Washington suddenly realized the truth. This wasn't a trade dispute anymore. This was the dismantling of the North American partnership, piece by piece, deal by deal, day by day. But the fallout wasn't stopping at economics. The very foundation of trust that bound the U.S. and Canada together for 150 years was starting to crack. And once trust is broken, you don't just patch it up with a handshake. You either rebuild from the ground up or watch the entire structure collapse. For more than 75 years, the U.S.-Canada partnership had been the crown jewel of North American stability. Trade flowed so seamlessly across the border that most people barely thought about it. A car part built in Ontario could cross the border 7 times before finally landing on an assembly line in Detroit. Power grids were linked, supply chains were shared, and the world's longest undefended border stood as a symbol of trust. But by late 2025, that trust was gone. The USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA and served as the backbone of US-Canada commerce, was suddenly hanging by a thread. Trump's team began threatening to rip it open, wielding tariffs like a baseball bat. Washington assumed Ottawa would cave under the pressure. Instead, something shocking happened. Canada didn't break. It bent the rules of the game. Mark Carney's strategy was working. While America bled from higher prices and fractured supply chains, Canada's economy proved surprisingly resilient. Why? 2 reasons. First, Canada's banking system, long ranked as one of the world's most stable, provided a safety net Washington didn't expect. While American markets swung wildly, Canada projected calm. Second, Canada's resource base was like a grocery list for the future. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, uranium, rare earths. And global partners were lining up. Europe, Asia, and Mexico all saw opportunity in Canada's pivot away from the US. Meanwhile, American industries were discovering just how dependent they actually were on their northern neighbor. The aluminum in your beer can? Canadian. The electricity powering US factories? Canadian. The auto parts keeping Detroit alive? Canadian. Every disruption hit US industries as hard, if not harder, than Canadian ones. And the pressure was building in Washington. In states like Michigan, New York, Washington, and Montana, factories were choking, jobs were disappearing, and businesses were begging their representatives to act. Local congressmen were hammered by voters demanding answers. Trump promised to punish Canada. But the reality was brutal. He was punishing his own base. And Carney? He hadn't even played his final card yet. Because this fight was never really about tariffs, it was about minerals. Canada's critical mineral strategy wasn't just economic policy, it was a global power shift in disguise. If Washington came crawling back, Canada would hold the leverage. If not, Europe and Asia would scoop up the supply, and America would be locked out of the future economy. Either way, Canada was winning. The fracture was no longer about trade deals. It was about trust. A century of goodwill between neighbors was gone in a matter of months. And once that bond breaks, it doesn't just heal overnight. America thought it was teaching Canada a lesson, but in reality, it had just shown the world something far more dangerous. Even the closest US allies couldn't trust Washington anymore. And other countries were watching very closely. So here's where it all stands. What began as a simple tariff hike spiraled into the most serious fracture in US-Canadian relations in over a century. Trump believed he could strong-arm his northern neighbor with a few strokes of a pen. Instead, he triggered a chain reaction that exposed America's deepest weakness, its dependence on the very allies it thought it could bully. Mark Carney didn't need missiles, armies, or bluster. He used patience, precision, and leverage. He turned Canada's hidden strength, its resources, its unity, and its alliances into weapons more devastating than any bomb. And in doing so, he proved that small countries can punch far above their weight if they play the game with strategy instead of ego. The result? America's most stable friendship has cracked wide open. And cracks, once formed, don't heal overnight. Trust isn't restored with a handshake or a press conference. It takes decades to rebuild, if it ever comes back at all. But here's the bigger picture. This isn't just about tariffs. It isn't even just about North America. This is about the global order itself. For years, Washington assumed its allies would always fall in line. But Canada just proved there's another way. Independence through diversification. And now, every US ally from Tokyo to Berlin is wondering, if Canada can stand up to America, why can't we? That's the real danger. Not the price hikes, not the empty condos in Florida, not even the trade losses. The real danger is the precedent. America's grip on its allies is slipping, and the multipolar world isn't on the horizon. It's already here. So the question now isn't whether Canada survives this trade war. It already has. The real question is whether the relationship that defined North American prosperity for 75 years can survive Donald Trump's gamble. One man's ego versus a century of trust. Who wins? And maybe even more important, what happens if America's other allies decide to follow Canada's lead? Because if history has taught us anything, it's this. Empires don't usually fall to their enemies. They fall when their friends walk away.